had always known my grandfather as a quiet man. He lived in an old house on the edge of Richmond, Virginia, where the windows seemed to breathe with the wind and the wooden beams groaned at night as if the house itself carried a burden. He was not affectionate, not gentle, yet he was never cruel either. His presence was like a shadow that never left the corner of the room. When I was a boy, I used to think he had no voice at all. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were measured, slow, as if he weighed every syllable against a memory too heavy to share. But one autumn night, when the leaves were falling and the air smelled of rain and iron, my grandfather began to speak to me. He did not tell me bedtime stories like other children heard. He did not tell me tales of heroes, or animals, or faraway kingdoms. My grandfather told me about death. He told me about the moments when the line between flesh and spirit was cut clean. When silence came after screaming, when a body became nothing more than a husk. I remember the firelight flickering across his face, throwing sharp angles across his hollow cheeks. His eyes did not look at me. They looked into the flames, but I knew he was seeing something far darker. His hands, scarred and rigid, rested on the arms of the chair, as if they still gripped something long gone. That was when he confessed to me. He said he had been an executioner, not by accident, not by chance, but by choice. He said his skill had been unmatched. He said people whispered his name long after the deed was done. And he said it with a voice that carried no pride, no shame, only a flat emptiness that made my stomach twist. That night was the first time I felt a fear that lived deeper than the skin. It was not the fear of monsters or ghosts. It was the fear that the man who had taught me how to hold a fishing rod, the man who had fixed my bicycle with his cracked hands, was something far worse than I could understand. My grandfather leaned closer to me and began to recount the first time. He had taken a life by order of the state. The condemned man had been dragged to the scaffold in the town square of Charleston. It was a hot morning, and the crowd pressed close, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. My grandfather said the man's eyes searched the faces around him, desperate for one sign of mercy, but there was none. The crowd wanted blood. My grandfather's duty was not only to end the man's life, but to do it with precision, to make it clean, swift, undeniable. He had been trained, he told me, in the old methods. The sound of the blade, the weight of it, the exact motion of his arms, all of it, had to be perfect. There could be no hesitation, no flaw, no tremor. He described the moment the blade fell. He described the way the crowd gasped as the body jerked once and then went still. He described the silence that followed, a silence thicker than the noise that had come before. He said it was in that silence that he first felt it, the mark that would never leave him, the mark of being the last face someone saw before darkness swallowed them. As he spoke, I felt the room grow colder, though the fire still burned. The shadows seemed to lengthen against the walls. I wanted to tell him to stop, but I could not. Something in his voice held me captive, as if he had opened a door I could not close. He told me there were worse executions than that, much worse. He told me there were times when the condemned fought so violently that he had to hold them down, his hands pressing against their flesh while their eyes bulged with terror. He told me of nights when the blade stuck, when the screams rose higher than the crowd's cheers, when the blood sprayed hot across his skin and would not wash away. I sat frozen, unable to move, every word driving deeper into me. Then his voice changed. It grew lower, harsher, like a growl that came from deep inside his chest. He said the executions never stayed on the scaffold. They followed him home. He would lie in bed and hear the scraping of rope against wood, the shuffle of feet, the sudden snap of silence. He would see faces staring at him from the corners of the room, faces pale and broken, lips moving without sound. He told me they were not memories. They were real. That night, I did not sleep. I kept seeing the flicker of firelight on his face, the way his eyes seemed to burn with something inhuman. Outside, The wind howled, and I swore I heard footsteps on the porch, though no one was there. The next morning he was silent again, as if none of it had ever been said. But I knew it was only the beginning, because after that night, my grandfather never stopped telling me. After that night, I could no longer look at my grandfather the same way. The silence that used to seem ordinary now pressed against me like a heavy curtain. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind through the trees outside, felt like it carried a memory that did not belong to me, but was being forced upon me. I tried to convince myself that what he told me had been a moment of weakness, an old man losing his grip on reality. But the next evening, when the fire burned low again, he began to speak without hesitation, as if he had been waiting all day for the night to return. This time he told me about a woman. He said she was the only woman he had ever been ordered to execute. Her name had been written in the record of the court, but he said he had never spoken it aloud again after that day. The memory of her face was enough. She had been accused of poisoning her husband and her children in their home in Savannah. People in the town had whispered about her for years, calling her cursed a witch, a temptress who had lured men to their graves. When the trial ended, the crowd demanded her death, more fiercely than any man who had ever stood before them. My grandfather described the morning of her execution. He said the air was colder than it should have been for that season. He remembered the sound of her footsteps as she was brought up the steps of the platform. He said they were not weak or trembling. They were steady, measured, as if she was walking to a place she already knew well. When he looked at her face, he did not see fear. He saw something else, something he could never name. Her eyes did not dart around the crowd, searching for mercy. They stayed fixed on him, as if she had been waiting for him all her life. He said it was the only time in all his years that his hands faltered. The weight of the blade felt wrong in his grip, as though the iron itself resisted him. The crowd jeered and shouted, the air vibrating with hunger, but in that moment his body betrayed him. He could not breathe, his vision darkened, and he felt as if the ground beneath the scaffold shifted. The woman whispered something before the blade fell. My grandfather said he could not hear the words, yet he felt them burn inside his skull. She did not cry, did not beg, did not fight. She only whispered, and then the steel cut through her throat, and the crowd roared in triumph. But he swore to me that she did not die. He said her body fell. Her head struck the platform, blood pooled like a dark river, yet her eyes remained open, wide and bright, staring at him with a gaze so sharp it carved into his soul. He looked down into the basket and saw her lips move. No sound came, but he saw the shape of the words. He said he could never forget those lips forming a single sentence. You are mine. After that day, he began to see her everywhere. In the glass of the window when the sun dipped low, in the reflection of water when he washed his hands, in the firelight at night when he tried to close his eyes. She came to him in dreams, and in those dreams she whispered the words again and again. You are mine. My grandfather leaned close to me as he told this. His breath was harsh, his voice so low it sounded like the rasp of wood against stone. He said, she never left. He said he still saw her, even as the years stretched on, even as the crowd forgot her name. I wanted to leave the room, but my body refused. My legs were rigid, my chest tight, my heart hammering like a drum. I felt as though the woman's eyes were now upon me, watching through my grandfather's hollow stare. Then, the fire sputtered and went out. We sat in darkness. Only the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside. My grandfather did not rise to relight the fire. He sat completely still, and in the silence I heard him whisper the words again. The words he swore the dead woman had spoken. You are mine. That night I dreamed of her. I was standing on the scaffold. The crowd stretched before me, faceless and gray, their mouths open in silent screams. I looked down and saw the blade in my own hands. A body knelt before me, long hair covering her face. Slowly she lifted her head and I saw her eyes. They were the same eyes my grandfather had described, cold, endless, and fixed upon me. Her lips moved, and I heard them clearly this time. "You are mine." I woke drenched in sweat, my throat dry, my hands trembling, but even awake I felt her presence, as though the dream had not ended at all. The next morning my grandfather was sitting at the table, drinking black coffee, his face blank, his eyes hollow. He looked at me once, and though he did not speak, I knew we had shared the same dream. By the third night, I no longer expected sleep. I stayed awake in my room, listening for the creak of my grandfather's chair, the sound of the fire being lit, the slow rhythm of his breath when he was about to begin. I told myself I would not go to him, that I would close my door and shut my ears. But when the fire crackled and his voice broke the silence, I found myself walking down the dark hallway, drawn like an insect to a flame. He was waiting. His eyes caught mine the moment I entered the room, and I knew he had been expecting me. He spoke without pause. He told me of the day the rope snapped. The condemned had been a large man, broad-shouldered, eyes filled with defiance. The crowd had gathered in the square, restless, eager, their voices humming like bees. My grandfather had prepared the noose with his own hands. He had tested the weight, the knot, the angle. He said he had never made mistakes. But that morning something was wrong. The man dropped, the rope tightened, and then with a crack, the fibers tore apart. The body slammed into the ground. The crowd erupted in screams, some in horror, some in anger, some in wild laughter. The man rolled onto his knees, coughing blood, his face red and swollen, but still alive. My grandfather said his orders were clear. The execution must be completed. There was no choice. He forced the man back up the steps, hands gripping him with a strength he did not know he still possessed. The man's eyes were wild now, spitting curses, his voice ragged with pain. But the crowd demanded silence. A new rope was brought. The man spat in my grandfather's face as the noose slid over his neck. My grandfather described the heat of the spit, the smell of it, mixed with sweat and fear, and something inside him broke. When the trap was pulled again, the rope held. The man's body convulsed, his neck snapped, and the silence fell once more. But my grandfather said he never forgot the feeling of that spit on his skin. He said it burned for years, no matter how he washed. Then he leaned toward me, his face close enough that I could see the cracks in his lips. He said the man was not finished. That night, when he closed his eyes, he felt the wet heat against his face again. He wiped his skin in panic, but the stain remained. He looked into the shadows of his room and saw the man's swollen face staring back at him, tongue black, eyes bulging, lips curling into a smile. My grandfather touched his own cheek as he told me this. His fingers shook. He said he still felt it now, even as he sat before me. As he spoke, I began to notice something strange. The shadows behind him seemed to shift, as though they were moving with the rhythm of his voice. For an instant I thought I saw a figure hanging in the corner of the room, a heavy body swaying on an invisible rope. I blinked, and it was gone. He told me there were moments during his career when the condemned did not go quietly, when they fought with animal ferocity. He described one man who clawed at the wood of the scaffold, his nails tearing away, blood streaking the boards as he screamed, that he would curse every soul in the town. My grandfather had to drag him by the hair, his fists striking like hammers against the man's ribs until the body collapsed from exhaustion. He told me of another who bit through his own tongue to choke on blood rather than give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing him beg. My grandfather said the man's body twitched for nearly an hour before death finally claimed him, the blood foaming at his lips, his teeth shattered against the wood. As these words filled the room, I could no longer sit still. My hands gripped the chair, my heart pounding as though I were standing on that scaffold myself. I felt the boards beneath my feet, heard the crowd's roar in my ears, smelled the copper tang of blood thick in the air. Then something happened that I cannot explain, as my grandfather described the man clawing at the scaffold. I heard it, the scrape of fingernails against wood, at first faint, then louder, sharper, until I was certain the sound came not from memory, but from somewhere in the room itself. I stared at the floorboards, and I saw the faint streaks of red appear, stretching slowly, as if dragged by invisible hands. I gasped, but my grandfather did not stop speaking. His eyes burned with a fever I had never seen. His voice no longer trembled with age. It was firm, steady, commanding. He told me that execution was not a job, it was a bond, that every life taken left a mark, and those marks did not fade. They grew layer upon layer, until they became something alive. He said he carried them all inside him, and they whispered to him in the night, voices pressing against his skull until he thought it would split. And then he looked at me in a way he never had before. He said that when he dies, the voices will not go with him. They will need a place to live. And his eyes held mine so tightly that I could not look away. In that moment, I felt the cold air close around me, as though unseen hands had reached out to touch my skin. The shadows in the corners deepened, and I heard the faint echo of a rope creaking, swinging gently, carrying a weight that I could not see. My grandfather whispered one last thing before falling silent. They are waiting for you. The days that followed were not normal. I tried to carry on with the rhythm of life, but the silence of my grandfather's house pressed on me like a weight. The walls seemed to listen. The windows reflected more than they should. I began to dread the night, but the daylight gave me no comfort either. The first sign came in the kitchen. I was pouring water into a glass when I noticed the faint crimson tinge swirling in the liquid. For a moment I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I lifted the glass closer to my face, the smell of iron hit me so sharply I gagged. I spilled it into the sink, and the water that splashed across the basin spread dark and thick before draining away. I went to tell my grandfather, but he was already sitting at the table, staring at me with eyes that seemed to know. He said nothing. He only lifted his hand slowly, and I saw his palm trembling. His lips formed a word without sound, and I knew it. Blood. That night I locked my bedroom door. I told myself I would not go to him when he began to speak again. I told myself I would shut out the sound, bury my head under the blanket, and pretend I was somewhere else. But when the fire crackled and the floor creaked, my body betrayed me. I opened the door. The air in the hallway was colder than before, and the house seemed to stretch, each step longer than the last, as if I were being pulled into some endless corridor. When I reached the living room, the fire was burning low, casting more shadow than light. My grandfather sat in his chair, and for the first time I realized he was not alone. At first I thought it was a trick of the fire. Figures moved in the corners, faint and blurred, as though smoke had taken the shape of people. But when I blinked, the shapes sharpened, faces half-formed, eyes hollow, mouths twisted open in silence. They swayed as if caught on ropes, bodies jerking in broken rhythms. I froze, but my grandfather spoke as if he did not see them. His voice was calm, steady, and in it I heard something new. It was not just memory. It was confession. He told me about the boy, the youngest he had ever executed, barely 18, convicted of murder, though many doubted the truth of it. The boy had begged for mercy as he was dragged to the gallows. He had cried out for his mother, his voice cracking, his body trembling so violently that the guards could hardly hold him. My grandfather said the crowd had been restless, shifting uneasily, as if even they did not want to see what was about to happen. But the order was given, and the boy was placed before him. My grandfather looked into his eyes and saw nothing but terror, the kind of terror that made his own hands hesitate. He said it was the first time he felt like a butcher rather than a servant of justice. The boy screamed until the trap was pulled. The sound cut off in an instant, and silence fell over the square like a blanket. But my grandfather swore that scream never ended. He said he still hears it, piercing, endless, vibrating inside his skull. As he told me this, I began to hear it. At first faint, like wind rushing through a crack in the wall, then sharper, higher, a sound that cut straight through my bones. It rose in the room around us, filling every corner, louder and louder, until I had to cover my ears. But my grandfather did not react. He sat unmoving, his voice continuing steadily, drowning in the scream as though he had grown used to it. I could not bear it. I shouted for him to stop, begged him, but he only looked at me with hollow eyes and said the boy's scream was not his alone anymore. He said it was mine now too. Then the figures in the corners moved closer. Their faces grew sharper, their eyes burned with a dead light. I saw ropes digging into their necks, skin torn, lips purple, tongues swollen. Their hands reached out, long and twisted, clawing the air as they shuffled nearer. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, but the walls seemed to close around me. My grandfather did not move. He simply whispered, as if speaking to himself, that the house was no longer ours, that it belonged to them. The fire went out, and darkness swallowed us whole. I ran to my room and locked the door, pressing my back against it, my chest heaving. In the silence that followed, I heard faint whispers, dozens of them, circling me, pressing against the wood of the door. They did not speak words I could understand, yet I felt their meaning sink into me like claws. When I finally dared to look toward the window, I saw her, the woman my grandfather had described, her face pale, her neck torn, her eyes fixed on me. She pressed her bloodied hand against the glass, and her lips moved in silence. "You are mine." I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, the window was empty. The next morning I found my grandfather in the kitchen, staring at the sink where the glass had shattered. He did not turn to me. He only said one sentence, his voice raw and hollow. "It has begun." I tried to escape the house that morning, after my grandfather's words. I stepped outside into the pale light of day, determined to breathe the air of Richmond and remind myself that the world was still solid, that it had not yet been swallowed by shadows. The streets were wet from rain, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air. Cars passed, people walked, the sound of traffic and voices filled the distance. It should have been comforting, but nothing felt real anymore. Every face I saw carried something unnatural. A man at the corner turned toward me, and for a brief second I thought his neck was twisted, the skin bruised as though rope had dug into it. A woman walked past, and her eyes locked on mine with a stare so cold I felt the blood drain from my body. A child's laughter rang across the street, but behind it I heard the high, piercing echo of the boy's endless scream. I clutched my coat tighter and kept walking. The world seemed to tilt beneath me, every sound sharpening until I thought I would lose my mind. When I reached the marketplace, I tried to ground myself in the ordinary. Stalls lined with fruit, voices calling prices, the smell of bread from the bakery on the corner. I forced myself to stop at a stall and pick up an apple, to feel its weight in my hand, to remind myself it was real. But when I looked down, the apple was no longer whole. A deep crack split its skin, and dark liquid seeped out, staining my hand. I dropped it, heart racing, and stumbled back. The vendor looked at me strangely, but when I glanced down again, the apple on the ground was whole, untouched, red, and shining in the sun. I left the marketplace without buying anything. As I turned the corner, I saw her again, the woman from my grandfather's story. She was standing at the far end of the street, her pale figure stark against the brick walls, her head tilted slightly, her long hair falling over one shoulder. Even from a distance, her eyes found me. I froze, unable to move, the weight of her gaze pressing against me. A man brushed past me, muttering, and when I looked back, she was gone. I hurried home, but the house no longer felt like a refuge. My grandfather was sitting in his chair by the fire, though he had not lit it. The shadows in the room were deep, swallowing the corners, and his face was barely visible in the dim light. He asked me where I had gone. His voice was not angry, not demanding, but hollow, as if he already knew. I told him I had gone to the market. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on something beyond me. Then he said the words that chilled me to the bone. "They will follow you now." I wanted to shout at him, to demand what he had done to me. But before I could speak, he began to tell another story. His voice was steady, as if reading from a book written long ago. He told me about the night executions. Not all deaths were carried out in the open square. Some were done quietly, in the dark, away from the eyes of the public. He said those were the worst, because without the noise of the crowd, without the roar of voices, the silence afterward was unbearable. He described one night when he was ordered to carry out a hanging in the courtyard of the prison. Only a handful of guards stood as witnesses. The condemned was a man accused of killing a child, though my grandfather said he had never been sure if the accusation was true. The man wept bitterly as he was led out, his body shaking so violently. The guards had to drag him across the ground. When the rope was placed around his neck, the man screamed that he was innocent. His voice echoed against the prison walls, sharp and desperate. My grandfather said he wanted to believe him, though it was too late. He pulled the lever. The body dropped. The rope snapped taut. The silence followed. But when my grandfather turned to leave, he heard footsteps behind him, heavy, dragging footsteps. He turned back, and for an instant he swore he saw the condemned still standing, the rope loose around his neck. Eyes wide with terror, from that night on, he heard those footsteps. Everywhere he went, in his home, in the streets, even in his sleep. The sound of a man who refused to stop following him. As he told me this, I heard it too. The faint thud of dragging feet echoing across the floor of the room. I turned in terror, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows shifting along the walls. My grandfather looked at me with eyes so hollow, they seemed like empty sockets. He said, the footsteps would not stop now. Not for me. I could not breathe. The walls of the house pressed closer, the air thick with the scent of iron and smoke. The whispers began again, circling me, dozens of voices rising and falling, some screaming, some laughing, some sobbing. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside me. When I finally looked up, I saw my grandfather smiling for the first time, but it was not a smile of warmth. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for this moment, who had always known it would come. He whispered one word, chosen. I no longer trusted my own eyes. The days blurred together, each one dripping into the next, and the line between waking and dreaming dissolved. Sometimes I would walk down the hallway of the house and suddenly find myself standing on a scaffold, the roar of a crowd vibrating in my skull, the stench of sweat and blood thick in my throat. Then, in the blink of an eye, I was back inside, my hand against the wall, my chest heaving. My grandfather's voice became constant. He spoke not only at night, not only by the fire, but throughout the day, as though the stories themselves refused to wait. Sometimes he spoke to me, sometimes to the shadows, sometimes to no one at all. Yet every word burrowed into me, until I could no longer tell if the memories belonged to him or to me. One night he told me about the mistakes. He said even the most skilled executioner cannot escape them. There were times when the blade dulled, when the rope twisted wrong, when the condemned clung to life longer than the crowd could bear. He said those moments were worse than any nightmare, because they did not end quickly. He described one man whose head did not fall cleanly. The blade struck bone and lodged halfway, and the man's screams filled the air as blood sprayed across the platform. My grandfather had to strike again and again, the steel hacking through flesh, the crowd howling with horror and fascination. He said his arms ached for days after, but what remained was not the pain, it was the sound, the wet crack of steel against bone. As he spoke, I heard it, clear and sharp, as though the sound was happening right beside me. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the noise grew louder, a rhythm of metal and flesh that beat in time with my racing heart. Then I smelled it, the iron tang of blood, heavy and thick, filling my nostrils until I thought I would choke. I looked down and saw it pooling at my feet, dark and endless, spreading across the wooden floorboards. I screamed, but my grandfather did not move. His eyes were locked on me, cold and steady, as though he had been waiting for me to see it. He told me this was the truth, that execution was not clean, not swift, not righteous. It was messy, brutal, filled with suffering that clung to the air and never faded. He said, the stains never left, no matter how much he washed, no matter how much time passed. And then he said, the stains were not his alone anymore. The fire flickered violently, shadows leaping across the walls, and suddenly, I was no longer in the house. I stood on the scaffold. The crowd stretched out before me, their faces blurred, their voices a storm of hunger. In my hands I held the blade, heavy and slick. A man knelt before me, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with sobs. I felt the weight of the moment press against me, and I knew it was me they were watching. Me they demanded blood from. The man lifted his face. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, and his lips moved. He was begging me, pleading for his life. I tried to drop the blade, but my arms would not obey. My body moved on its own, muscles tightening, hands gripping the handle. The crowd roared louder, voices crashing like waves, demanding the strike. I cried out, but no sound left my throat. My body moved again, the blade lifting high. The man screamed, and for an instant his voice became the voice of the boy, the endless scream that never faded. Then the blade fell. Blood sprayed across me, hot and wet, burning against my skin. The crowd erupted, their roar shaking the world, and I felt something break inside me. When I blinked, I was back in the living room, standing before the fire, my hands empty, but my clothes were wet, clinging to my skin. I looked down, and though the firelight was dim, I saw the stains, dark, red, seeping slowly across the fabric. My grandfather smiled. His voice was soft, almost tender. Now you understand. I stumbled back, shaking the taste of iron thick on my tongue. I wanted to deny it, to scream that none of it was real, but deep down I knew it was too late, because I no longer carried only my memories. I carried his, and I carried theirs. The voices rose around me, dozens, hundreds, whispering, screaming, laughing, weeping, all at once. They pressed against my skull until I thought it would split, and through it all, one voice cut, clear. The woman, you are mine. Sleep, abandon me. I no longer closed my eyes without seeing the scaffold, without feeling the weight of the blade, without hearing the rope creak above my head. Even in the brightness of morning I saw shadows where none should be, figures swaying at the edge of my vision, lips moving in silence. My grandfather no longer told stories. He did not need to. The voices told them for him. At first they came at night, whispering in the corners of the room, filling the silence with fragments of pain. But soon they were everywhere. In the dripping of the faucet, in the wind rattling the windows, in the hum of electricity through the walls. Words hidden inside sounds, begging, cursing, screaming, always screaming. I tried to leave the house again, to escape the prison of memories. But the world outside had changed. The streets of Richmond were alive with the dead. Every face I passed, blurred, twisted, then snapped into sharp, grotesque forms. Eyes bulging, lips blue, necks bruised and torn. A man brushed my shoulder, and I felt rope fibers scratch across my skin. A woman glanced at me and her eyes rolled, white, her jaw unhinging in a silent shriek. I ran, heart pounding, and when I reached the river, I bent to drink, desperate to clear my head. But the water reflected not my face, but hers. The woman with the torn throat, her lips moved, the same words, the same claim. You are mine. I staggered back, choking, and when I turned, I saw him, my grandfather, standing on the opposite bank, though I had left him at the house. He watched me with those hollow eyes, unmoving, a silhouette cut against the mist. Then, without raising his voice, I heard him inside my head, "Do not fight it." I fled back to the house, but the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a cell. The walls pulsed with whispers. The floor creaked beneath unseen weight. The windows reflected faces I did not know. My grandfather sat in his chair, silent, watching me as though waiting for something to break. That night, the dreams became worse. I was not on the scaffold. I was below it, standing in the crowd. The people pressed against me, their faces smeared with blood, their eyes empty. They chanted, their voices merging into a single roar, my name echoing in their mouths. They demanded me. They demanded my hand to carry the blade, to pull the rope, to end the lives they thrust before me. And when I looked up at the platform, I saw myself standing there, my own hands gripping the handle of the axe, my own face twisted with determination. My double raised the blade high, and the crowd howled my name. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat, my body trembling. My grandfather was in my room, sitting in the chair by my bed. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and his lips moved with a whisper. Chosen the next day, I felt it for the first time. The hunger, it came without warning, a surge through my veins like fire. My hands shook, my jaw clenched, my body burned with a need I could not name. And then I understood. It was not hunger for food or thirst for water. It was hunger for the moment he had described so many times. The moment of silence after the scream, the moment when the life in front of me went still. I fought it. I tried to push it down, but the voices fed it, whispering, urging, begging. My grandfather watched me, his lips curling into that hollow smile. He told me it was not a curse. It was an inheritance. That night I dreamed again, but it did not feel like a dream. I was in the courtyard of the prison. A man knelt before me, bound, trembling, his voice cracking as he pleaded for mercy. My grandfather stood beside me, the rope in his hands. He placed it in mine, his eyes locking with mine, and in that gaze, I saw no choice. I slipped a noose over the man's neck. The crowd was gone. The guards were gone. There was only me, my grandfather, and the condemned. The man begged, tears streaming down his face, and for a moment, I hesitated. But then the hunger surged again, so powerful it drowned out everything else. My hands moved on their own, pulling the lever. The man dropped, the rope tightened, his body convulsed. His scream pierced me, but instead of pain, I felt something else, relief when I woke. My hands were clenched so tightly that blood dripped from my palms, and in the silence of the room, my grandfather's voice came to me, steady and calm. You cannot run from what you are. I awoke to the sound of breathing, not my own, not my grandfather's. Heavy, ragged, broken breaths that filled the room as though a dozen people were crouched in the dark around me. I sat up, my chest tight, and the air moved with the sound of invisible lungs. The shadows stirred, figures shifted against the walls, half-formed, their faces hollow, their bodies bent as though still dangling from the rope. Their eyes glowed, faint and wet, like dying embers in the night. They watched me, but none moved closer. They did not need to. Their presence pressed against me until I thought my ribs would crack. Then the whisper came again, her voice. You are mine. I shouted at the dark, my throat raw, begging for silence, begging for freedom. But the more I screamed, the louder they became. A chorus of every throat ever slit, every neck ever snapped, every body ever lowered into the earth by my grandfather's hand. Their voices thundered against my skull, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The hunger returned. It clawed through me like fire, devouring reason, devouring fear, leaving only a single need. I stumbled from my room into the hallway, every step echoing as though I walked through endless chambers. The house stretched wrong, the walls longer, the ceilings higher. Shadows spilling into shapes I could not understand. I found my grandfather in the kitchen. He sat at the table, hands folded, eyes burning. He did not speak, he only nodded, once, slow and deliberate, as though giving permission. My breath shook, my chest heaving, the fire of hunger gnawing inside me. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, desperate to breathe air that was not tainted with screams. Outside, the night was heavy, thick mist rolling across the street. The lamps glowed faint and distant, halos of dim light barely piercing the fog. I walked with no sense of direction, each step carrying me deeper into silence, until I heard it, footsteps, soft, hurried, somewhere behind me. I turned, but the mist swallowed everything. Only emptiness. Still, the sound came again, quicker, closer. My skin crawled, my pulse thundered, and then through the haze a figure appeared, a man, alone, walking with his collar pulled high against the cold, his face hidden in the dark. The hunger struck me so violently I staggered. My hands shook, my teeth clenched, every nerve inside me screaming for release. I tried to turn away, to run, but my body betrayed me. My legs carried me closer, silent, steady, a predator's gait. The man did not notice me until I was only a few steps away. He turned, startled, his eyes wide. "You all right, buddy?" His voice cracked the night, a fragile human sound, and for an instant I wanted to answer, to tell him yes, to tell him no, to beg him to run, but no words came. My mouth moved, but only a rasp escaped, a breath like rope tightening. His face changed, alarm sharpened into fear. He stepped back, hands rising. And then the hunger broke through me entirely. I lunged, the world blurred into violence. My hands clamped around his throat, the texture of flesh and bone electric under my grip. His eyes bulged, his mouth opened, in a scream, but the night swallowed it. My arms tightened, tighter, tighter, until the air wheezed out of him. His body thrashed, his fists pounded against me, but the strength that filled me was not mine. It was his, my grandfather's. Centuries of shadow driving through my veins. I watched him fade. His skin grew pale, his lips blue, his eyes rolling back. And as the last tremor left him, as the silence spread through his body, the hunger inside me released. Relief, sweet, intoxicating relief. I staggered back, my chest heaving, my hands trembling and slick. The man lay at my feet, still, his face twisted in the final moment of fear. For a long time I could not move. The mist curled around us, the lamps hummed, the night watched. Then I heard it. Applause, slow, steady, deliberate. I turned and saw him, my grandfather, standing in the mist, his hands clapping, his face split with a smile that was no longer human. His eyes glowed white, burning holes in the fog. He told me I had taken the first step, that there was no turning back, that the dead had chosen me now, not him, and behind him, the shadows stirred. Dozens, hundreds, forming a wall of silent bodies, their faces glowing faintly in the fog. They watched me with hollow eyes, and in unison, their mouths opened. "You are ours." The night after the killing did not end. I stumbled back into the house with blood dried on my hands, the fog still clinging to my clothes, my lungs burning with the memory of his last breath. My grandfather was waiting, not in his chair this time. He stood in the hallway, tall, straight, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. His eyes pierced me with a pride that chilled me deeper than fear. He told me nothing with words. He only nodded, and that nod carved itself into me like a mark. A sealed dot. The voices did not wait. They rose inside me the moment I lay down, swelling, until my skull felt ready to split. They no longer whispered. They shouted. My name, my duty, my inheritance. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound came from within. not from without. At some point I fell into a dream, or what I thought was a dream. I was back on the scaffold. The crowd below was vast, endless, their faces pale and blank, their bodies trembling with feverish anticipation. The condemned stood before me, their hands bound, their eyes darting like trapped animals. My grandfather stood at my side, the blade in his hands. He offered it to me. I reached out and took it. The wood of the handle was slick, wet with sweat or blood, I could not tell. The weight settled into my palms like it had always belonged there. The condemned begged, their words, nothing but noise, their sobs filling the silence between each heartbeat. I raised the blade. The crowd roared. I brought it down. Their scream tore through the dream, and for a moment I believed I was still asleep, until I opened my eyes and saw my grandfather standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. His lips parted, and though his voice was low, I heard every word as though it were spoken inside my head. One by one, the hunger returned stronger than before. It pulsed in my blood, my veins swelling with it, my skin trembling under the weight of it. Every sound around me was too loud, every shadow too sharp, every movement a temptation. The world itself became a prison of throats waiting to be broken. I tried to resist. I locked myself in my room, nails digging into my palms, teeth clenched, until blood filled my mouth. But the voices would not stop. They called me with the names of strangers, faces I had never seen, lives I had never known. They demanded me to finish what my grandfather had begun. The first one was a woman I saw outside the grocery store. She smiled politely as we passed each other, and in that moment the hunger clawed so violently that I gripped the metal railing until it bent beneath my hand. I followed her without meaning to, my body moving on its own. Her perfume lingered in the air, sweet and suffocating, and all I could think of was how her throat would taste when the breath left it. I stopped myself. I turned away, gasping, retching, pressing my face into the cold brick wall until the pain cut through the madness. For a moment, I thought I had won, but that night she appeared in my dream. She knelt before me on the scaffold, her eyes wide, her mouth forming words I could not hear. My grandfather placed the rope in my hands. The crowd roared. When I woke, my fingernails were caked with dirt, my hands raw, and the taste of blood lingered on my tongue. The line between dream and waking. Life was gone. The next time I saw the mist curling over the street, I did not fight it. I walked into it willingly. The voices guided me, pulling me through the fog until I found another stranger. A man leaning against the wall of a closed diner, smoking, his eyes half shut with boredom. He never saw me coming. When it was over, when his body sagged and slid to the ground, the hunger broke again inside me, flooding me with relief so powerful I nearly collapsed. I looked up, panting, trembling, and saw the mist filled with faces. The condemned, the executed, the forgotten. They stared at me, not with hatred, but with devotion. They bowed their heads, and then my grandfather stepped forward from their ranks. His eyes glowed brighter than ever, his hands reaching out. "You are no longer mine." The voices swelled, a single, unified chorus. "You are ours." And I knew then that it was no longer his shadow I walked in. I had become something else. A vessel, a weapon, a continuation of a legacy too dark to ever end. The scaffold was no longer in my dreams. It was everywhere. The world did not end with dawn. I waited for light to wash it all away, for the sun to burn through the fog, for reality to return. But the morning came gray, heavy, suffocating. The air itself was thick, every sound swallowed before it reached my ears. I walked through the streets as though I no longer belonged to them. Faces passed me, unaware, their laughter brittle, their voices faint. Yet behind every smile, I saw the rope. Behind every step, I heard the scaffold creak. Their necks bent in my imagination, their bodies twitching in the final spasms of breath. The voices did not fade. They had become a storm inside me, each name louder than the last, each demand sharper. I tried to resist, but the hunger now ruled every beat of my heart. It was not a choice. It was destiny. That night the dreams returned, not as dreams but as a place more real than the streets of Boston where I stood. I was back on the scaffold, but this time there was no crowd, no condemned, only me and him. My grandfather stood at the edge, his figure darker than shadow, his eyes burning like pale fire. He looked at me for a long time, and then he spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like steel. I was only the beginning. You are the end. He stepped back, and the floor of the scaffold split open. From the abyss below, they rose. Hundreds, thousands, every face he had ever executed, every soul I had begun to claim. Their hollow eyes fixed on me, their mouths moving, in unison, one by one, forever. They rushed forward, hands clawing, mouths stretching wide, but instead of dragging me down, they lifted me, raised me above the scaffold, above the gallows, above the abyss. I hung in the air, their voices tearing through me, until my body was nothing but their vessel. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the dream. I was standing in the center of my bedroom. The noose hung from the ceiling. The rope was coarse and damp, its fibers stained with something too dark to be only age. The voices commanded me to place it around my neck, but as I reached for it, I realized it was not meant for me. It was meant for them. For all of them. The house expanded, its walls stretching, its windows vanishing. I stood once more on the scaffold, but this time it was endless, an infinite platform in the void, lined with gallows that swayed with invisible wind, and from every gallows hung ropes, waiting, swaying, hungry. The crowd returned, but they were not strangers. They were the people I had seen that day, the ones I had passed on the street, the ones who would cross my path tomorrow, the ones who had yet to even be born, their eyes fixed on me, their breaths shallow, their throats exposed. I understood. Then there was no escape, no choice. I was the hand of the rope, the edge of the blade, the silence that follows the scream. I was the executioner now, not by bloodline, but by eternity. The hunger filled me one last time, searing through me until I could no longer tell where I ended and where they began. I raised my hands, and the ropes swung forward, tightening, twisting, snapping bone and breath alike. The sound was endless. The silence after was deeper than any I had ever known. When it was done, I stood alone. The gallows stretched forever in every direction, each rope swaying gently in a wind I could not feel. My grandfather was gone. The crowd was gone. Only I remained, but the voices did not stop. They whispered still, softer now, more intimate. They told me I was ready. They told me it would never end. I looked down at my hands, and they were not my own. They were bound in calluses, scarred with rope burns, stained with the permanence of blood. I understood the truth. I was no longer the grandson. I was the gallows. I was the rope. I was the execution, and I would be forever.